Saipan. July to 4. If you found yourself there at that moment, the first thing to hit your senses wouldn't have been the smell of gunpowder, not even the sound of gunfire. It would have been the heat. 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity was so thick, the air felt less like a gas and more like a sticky liquid clogging your lungs with every breath. Amid the tangled roots of a banyan tree covered in mud and sweat, a man lay. A Japanese sniper. His name didn't matter. Neither did his rank. What mattered was that he hadn't eaten in 3 days. His canteen had been empty since morning, and his Arisaka rifle was the only friend he had left. He waited. Below in the valley, an American patrol was moving. Noisy, careless giants in green helmets. To him, they weren't people, they were overseas devils, monsters who'd come to burn down his home. The sniper took aim. His finger rested on the trigger, but no shot followed, because he saw something his brain simply couldn't process. The Americans had stopped. They sat right on the ground, ignoring the danger. One of them reached into his pack and pulled out a glass bottle. The sniper watched through his scope. He saw beads of condensation trickling down the curved glass. He saw the dark brown liquid, and he saw the soldier take a sip, then lean his head back with an expression of pure, unearthly bliss. It was Coca-Cola, and in that moment, in the suffocating heat, the Japanese soldier understood something terrifying. He understood that the war was lost, not because the Americans had more tanks, and not because their planes filled the sky, but because his army couldn't even deliver him a handful of clean rice. Meanwhile, the enemy had stretched a supply line across half the globe, through minefields and submarine zones, just to deliver an ice-cold soda to a private for his lunch. This wasn't a beverage. It was a demonstration of power so profound it could make your blood run cold, even in that hellish heat. But how? How the hell was that even possible? To understand this, we need to leave the jungles of Saipan. We need to rewind time and travel 8,000 miles to the east, to the office of a man who, with a single signature, turned sugar water into the most effective psychological weapon of World War II. The year is 1943, North Africa. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who would plan the Normandy landings a year later, is sitting in a dusty headquarters. Before him are endless lists. The logistics of war are a nightmare. Armies need millions of gallons of fuel, tons of steel, mountains of bandages and morphine. Every cubic inch in a ship's hold is worth its weight in gold. And then, on June 29th, Eisenhower sends a secret telegram to Washington, marked urgent, highest priority. Military clerks at the Pentagon expected a request for new artillery shells or Jeep parts. But Eisenhower asked for something else. He demanded 3 million bottles of Coca-Cola. And not just the bottles. He demanded the complete equipment, parts, and chemicals to build 10 bottling plants. Right there, in the combat zone. It sounds like madness. Imagine, the most terrible war in human history is raging, and the Supreme Allied Commander is spending precious time on a soft drink. But Eisenhower was no fool. He knew his human resources. The American soldier, the GI, was a citizen pulled from a comfortable life. He wasn't a Spartan, born for war. He missed home, and nothing, absolutely nothing, reminded him of home like that fizzy liquid. This is where Robert Woodruff enters the stage. At the time, he was the president of the Coca-Cola Company, and when he learned of America's entry into the war, he made what was arguably the most brilliant and riskiest business move of the 20th century. Woodruff issued a directive. Every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents wherever he is, and whatever it costs our company. Think about that, 5 cents. That was a losing price even in peacetime for remote regions. Delivering a bottle to a trench under mortar fire in Italy cost dozens of times more. But Woodruff didn't care. He understood that if he could put this symbol of America into the hands of every soldier, he would forge a bond that couldn't be broken for decades. But there was a catch, a huge one. Sugar was scarce and rationed. Glass was needed for medicine, steel for tanks. The US government strictly rationed all resources. How could he convince the government to give strategic materials to a sugar water manufacturer? Woodruff made a brilliant pivot. He rebranded his drink. Coca-Cola was no longer entertainment. In official documents, it became an essential war material for maintaining morale. It was listed right alongside ammunition and bandages. The War Department gave the green light. The project was codenamed Technical Observers, but the soldiers called them something simpler, Cola Kernels. These were civilian engineers from the company who were issued officer uniforms, insignia, and army ranks, so they could command and move freely around the front. Their mission was both simple and impossible, to build a global network of plants where bombs had fallen just the day before, and they got to work. The biggest problem for any army is weight. Military logisticians call it tonnage. A standard glass bottle of soda is 90% water. Shipping water across an Atlantic infested with German U-boats would have been a crime. It meant taking up space that could have held shells or medical supplies with plain water that could be found in Europe. Coca-Cola's engineers found a solution that seems obvious today, but was revolutionary at the time: decentralization. They didn't ship the finished product. They shipped the essence. The secret syrup concentrate took up 20 times less space. America supplied the syrup, filters, and carbon dioxide. The water and bottles were sourced locally. But sourcing locally in war-torn Europe was no easy task. Here's an example. Naples, 1944, the city is in ruins. The water mains are bombed out. There's no electricity. A cola colonel arrives. His task? Get a bottling line running in 48 hours because the soldiers of the Fifth Army are at their breaking point. There isn't enough equipment. What does he do? He finds a wrecked truck and pulls the engine. He uses that engine to power the conveyor belt. Instead of proper water filters, he uses sand and charcoal sifted through army blankets. Instead of branded bottles, they collect any glassware they can find in the ruins. Wine bottles, jam jars, anything. And 2 days later, the plant produces its first batch. It might have tasted a bit harsh. The carbonation wasn't perfect, but to the soldiers caked in the dust of Italian roads, it was the nectar of the gods. In the Pacific, the situation was even more challenging. There were no cities, there were islands, and the cola colonels created jungle dispensers, portable dispensers designed for the jungle. These were bright red metal boxes that could be parachuted directly into combat zones. Inside was a gas cylinder, a syrup tank, and a cooling system. But wait, a cooling system? In the jungle, where the temperature rarely drops below 86 degrees Fahrenheit even at night. There's no electricity in the trenches. Generators are needed for radios and radar. How do you make a drink cold when you don't have a refrigerator? This was a challenge that required more than just engineering ingenuity. It required breaking all the rules of military discipline, and American soldiers were more than willing to break those rules. The Pacific Front. Here, the enemy wasn't just the Japanese, the enemy was the heat. Imagine sitting in a foxhole on Guadalcanal. At that temperature, a warm soda turns into a cloying, sticky syrup that only makes you thirstier. It's disgusting. The soldiers needed ice, but there was nowhere to get it, and that's when physics came into play. Soldiers knew that as you gain altitude, the temperature drops. For every 1,000 feet, it drops by about 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Pilots of Corsair fighters and B-17 bombers began flying strange missions unlisted on any flight logs. Before a combat sortie or a training flight, they'd find space in the fuselage to stash a case of bottles, or they'd even hang nets of the drink under the wings. They would take their planes up to 20,000 feet. Up in the sky, the temperature was well below freezing. The plane would circle for 30 minutes, just long enough for the liquid to chill to a perfect 34 degrees Fahrenheit, without freezing solid and shattering the glass. When they landed, the whole squadron would run to the plane not to check for damage, but to retrieve the precious cargo. But it was dangerous, not because of the enemy, because of physics. A carbonated drink under pressure at altitude can explode. Several pilots told stories of their cockpits being flooded with sticky foam right in the middle of a dogfight. Instruments would get sticky, the windscreen clouded over. It was madness, risking a plane worth hundreds of thousands of dollars for a case of 5-cent soda. But command looked the other way, because they knew those cold bottles boosted morale better than any patriotic speech. On the ground, they were just as resourceful. Sherman tank mechanics discovered that if you wrapped a bottle in a wet sock, tied it to the radiator grill, and drove the tank, the evaporating water in the wind would cool the contents. The effect of evaporative cooling. Navy engineers used carbon dioxide fire extinguishers. They would vent the gas through makeshift coils, creating a flash freeze. It was a whole underground industry of cold. And that was the essence of the American approach to war. Americans didn't just survive, they tried to make war comfortable. They brought a piece of their way of life with them. But if it was just a taste of home for the boys from Iowa or Texas, for their enemies on the other side of the front line, it looked completely different. To them, it was proof they weren't fighting men, they were fighting gods of logistics. Let's go back to that Japanese sniper from the beginning of the story, or the thousands of others like him. While American pilots were chilling coke in the stratosphere, the Japanese army was starving. The Imperial Army's logistics had collapsed. Supply ships were being sunk by American submarines. Island garrisons were cut off for months. Soldiers were eating tree bark, rats, and even their own leather belts boiled in seawater. Water was a luxury. Clean water was a miracle. And then, in the midst of this hell, they captured American positions or found a discarded ration pack. And what did they see? Chocolate, cigarettes, canned meat, and millions of those ubiquitous bottles. One Japanese officer wrote a line in his diary that has become legendary among historians. "We knew we had lost when we saw the Americans were building roads in the jungle not for tanks, but for trucks carrying ice cream and soda." Do you see the point? This message needed no translation. It hit you right in the subconscious. If your enemy can afford to waste resources on something as trivial as bubbly sugar water, it means their resources are infinite. It means their home front is running like clockwork. It means their society isn't straining to destroy you. It's doing it casually, with a bottle in hand. That is more demoralizing than carpet bombing. A bombing raid inspires fury. A cold Coca-Cola in a dead enemy's hand inspires despair. There's a well-known story about German prisoners of war at the end of the war. As they were being transported through the American rear lines in France, they saw mountains of empty Coke crates along the roads. One of the prisoners, a former Luftwaffe engineer, said, "I thought the propaganda about America's resources was a lie, but I see these mountains of trash, and I realize Goebbels was the one lying to us about our hope for victory." Coca-Cola became a symbol of abundance, a symbol of the American way of life that advanced right alongside the infantry. They weren't just capturing territory, they were exporting a culture. And this brings us to the most interesting paradox. The war ended. The weapons were laid down, the soldiers went home, the tank factories closed or switched to making tractors. But the Coca-Cola plants, those tsuku facilities built by the technical observers around the world, they didn't close, they stayed. In 1945, the guns fell silent, but for the Coca-Cola Company, in a global sense, the war had just begun. Only now it was a war for markets, and they had an advantage no other company in history had ever had. The US government had essentially built them a global distribution network with taxpayer money. 64 plants in Europe, Africa, and Asia, ready-made supply chains, a trained local workforce, and most importantly, millions of new customers. Locals who had tasted the drink from the hands of their liberators now associated its flavor with freedom, with victory, with America. And the million American veterans who returned home couldn't imagine a day without a bottle of Coke. It was a habit forged in the foxholes. Robert Woodruff didn't just sell a soda, he sold an idea. He made his product as ubiquitous as the air. Today, if you travel to the most remote village in the Andes or the deepest parts of the Sahara Desert, you will likely find that red can. That is the legacy of Eisenhower's telegram. And what about the sniper? That Japanese soldier on Saipan never fired his shot. He was later captured. He survived the camp, returned to a devastated Japan, and helped build a new country. The story goes that in the 80s, now an old man, he was walking down a street in Tokyo. Skyscrapers, neon signs, the roar of the metropolis. He stopped at a vending machine. He dropped in a coin. The machine whirred, and a cold can dropped into the slot. He opened it. The same sound, the same smell, the taste that once signified defeat and the death of his empire. Now, it was just the taste of a cool evening, the taste of a world that had changed beyond recognition. Because in the end, wars aren't just won by generals and atomic bombs. Sometimes they're won by a simple 5-cent bottle of soda that was in the right place at the right time, and which told the world more than 1,000 diplomatic notes ever could. We're here, and we have ice.